They planted the fields, they prayed for rain, and when the harvest came, they expected contracts, checks, and buyers lining up to move America's crops overseas. But instead, there was silence. No deals, no markets, no hope. In just 6 weeks, U.S. farm exports to China collapsed by 28%. Almond shipments from California vanished. Dairy products rotted in warehouses. At the port of Oakland alone, shipments fell by 40%. For hay exporters in Washington, it meant laying off a quarter of their workers almost overnight. This isn't some distant headline. It's the collapse of the American farm economy, quiet, sudden, and government-approved. So how does the richest agricultural system on Earth end up begging for markets while its leaders celebrate a trade war? How do farmers, once the backbone of America's independence, become casualties in a geopolitical battle they never asked to fight? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, who will still be standing when the dust clears? This is not just about tariffs, politics, or foreign deals. This is about survival, where today, we uncover the story of how America's farm belt was brought to its knees by a war no one won, and why the clock is still ticking. It didn't begin with headlines or breaking news. It began in silence. Across the Midwest, farmers walked into overflowing silos, stared at crops stacked higher than the rafters, and realized there was no one left to buy. The collapse of American agriculture didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived quietly, disguised as tariffs, paperwork, and canceled contracts. Sorghum was the first victim. For decades, China relied on U.S. sorghum to fuel its livestock industry, purchasing over 90% of American exports. Farmers considered it one of the safest bets in the trade game. But when tariffs shot past 125%, the market didn't just shrink, it vanished. Shipments plummeted from 1.44 million metric tons in early 2023 to a jaw-dropping 78,000 tons in 2025. That wasn't a dip. That was a 94% obliteration of an entire trade pipeline. Farmers who had borrowed against next season's harvest suddenly faced mountains of debt. Grain prices tanked, silos overflowed, and buyers disappeared. Yet Washington's response was astonishingly out of touch. Instead of structural solutions, farmers were handed promises and press releases. Instead of access to markets, they were told to hang tight while global competitors rushed in to replace them. Meanwhile, China didn't hesitate. They pivoted to Brazil and Argentina with the speed of a nation that had planned for this exact moment. Long-term contracts were signed. Infrastructure upgrades were fast-tracked. American farmers were cut out of deals that once seemed permanent. The fallout was devastating. Entire communities that depended on agriculture watched their lifeline collapse in months, not years. And yet, the administration kept repeating the same message, that tariffs were leverage, that pain was temporary, that the farm belt would come out stronger. But in the fields, nobody believed it anymore. Because this wasn't a negotiation, it was survival. When China slammed the door on U.S. farmers, they didn't just walk away. They built a new door, locked it, and threw away the key. Within months, Beijing redirected billions in grain and soybean contracts to Brazil and Argentina, nations that were ready, willing, and eager to replace America. The numbers tell the story. Brazil's soybean exports to China surged 25% year over year, while U.S. soy futures tumbled 14% in just the first quarter of 2025. And it wasn't just soy. Corn, wheat, oilseed, and even livestock feed contracts shifted southward. For China, this wasn't a stopgap. These were long-term, strategic deals designed to permanently sever dependence on American crops. Brazil invested heavily in port expansions, storage facilities, and rail infrastructure. Argentina rolled out subsidies to guarantee steady shipments. Beijing, in turn, signed multi-year contracts that locked in these partnerships. Once those supply chains were built, there was no going back. You can't just rip up a contract, rebuild a port, and expect buyers to return overnight. And that was Washington's fatal miscalculation. Policymakers assumed tariffs were temporary tools, applied one year, reversed the next, with little consequence. But trade doesn't bend to political cycles. It bends to logistics, trust, and cost efficiency. By the time Washington realized it, the global map of agriculture had already been redrawn. For American farmers, this pivot was catastrophic. They weren't just losing contracts, they were being erased from the spreadsheets of the world's largest buyer. The silos in Iowa and Kansas weren't holding surplus. They were holding the remains of a market America no longer owned. And while the Farm Belt collapsed quietly in the fields, the ripple effects were about to hit America's ports, where the damage was measured not just in dollars, but in jobs. If the collapse in the fields was devastating, the breakdown at America's ports was catastrophic. The Port of Oakland, once the beating heart of U.S. refrigerated agricultural exports, suddenly became a graveyard of idle containers. Almonds destined for Asia sat rotting in boxes. Dairy tankers were redirected mid-route, only to be canceled. Exporters were forced to pay staggering demurrage fees on shipments literally abandoned at sea. For dock workers, truck drivers, and warehouse crews, this wasn't just a trade story. It was their paychecks. Christy McKenna, Oakland's executive director, warned that retaliatory tariffs weren't just killing exports, they were putting livelihoods on the line. Oakland thrives on balance, half imports, half exports. But with nearly 30% of its trade tied directly to China, tariffs shattered that equilibrium. Suddenly, America's busiest agricultural port looked more like a parking lot. The collapse spread quickly. In Washington state, hay exporters reported 68 blanked sailings in the weeks after Trump's April 2nd tariff spike. One supplier laid off a quarter of its staff in just 14 days. A wood pulp company had 6,400 metric tons stuck in warehouses, with 15 rail cars racking up fees daily as they waited for rerouting that never came. And a massive 9,000-ton shipment bound for China was abandoned altogether, written off as a total loss. The cruelest part? Agriculture runs on razor-thin margins. These aren't luxury goods with room for price hikes. For hay, sorghum, or pulp, even small cost increases make survival impossible. When freight prices exploded, exporters faced a choice: sell at a guaranteed loss or not sell at all. And as the ports stalled, another disaster unfolded. The very policies meant to protect U.S. farmers would deliver one of the most punishing blows yet. Just when farmers thought the tariffs were their biggest problem, Washington delivered a blow from an entirely different angle. In a move meant to punish China, the U.S. introduced a new rule, the so-called Ships Act port fee. Every Chinese vessel entering American ports was hit with a staggering $1.5 million charge. On paper, bulk agriculture was exempt. In practice, the carve-outs failed. The oversight meant containerized goods, the backbone of U.S. farm exports, were suddenly caught in the crossfire. Beef, poultry, dairy, almonds, frozen foods, and even processed items like French fries were all lumped into a category now subject to massive extra costs. According to USDA figures, containerized agriculture makes up 55% of all U.S. farm export value. And yet, the government's own rule had effectively targeted its most profitable segment. Industry leaders immediately sounded the alarm. Peter Friedman of the Agriculture Transportation Coalition warned on CNBC that, without exemptions, exporters would be forced to operate at losses until they stopped shipping entirely. Farmers pleaded for corrections, exemptions, or at the very least, adjustments to protect perishable goods. But Washington stayed silent. The fallout was swift and brutal. Contracts were shredded, shipments stalled, margins disappeared. For families who had relied on farming for generations, it didn't feel like protection anymore. It felt like sabotage. The very government claiming to defend American agriculture was piling on costs that exporters could not absorb. And yet, instead of fixing the problem, the White House pointed to bailouts as the solution. But farmers didn't want checks. They wanted markets. They wanted buyers. They wanted a future. What they got instead were broken promises and more proof that Washington's solutions were nothing more than temporary bandages on a gaping wound. When the crisis deepened, Washington turned to its old playbook: bailouts. Just like during Trump's first trade war, when more than $32 billion was shoveled into emergency farm payments, the White House promised checks would save the Farm Belt once again. But this time, farmers weren't fooled. They knew cash on paper didn't equal contracts on the ground. A bailout might help cover interest on loans or keep the lights on for another month, but it doesn't reopen ports. It doesn't rebuild broken supply chains. And it certainly doesn't restore trust with international buyers who have already shifted to Brazil and Argentina. As one Iowa farmer told Bloomberg, "A check can't replace a market, it just slows down the funeral." Across the Midwest, desperation replaced optimism. In Iowa, corn farmers admitted they were planting knowing they would lose money, because planting nothing meant bankruptcy would hit even faster. In Kentucky, farmers debated whether harvesting was even worth the cost. They weren't chasing profit anymore. They were triaging losses, stretching every dollar to keep their land alive for just one more season. The contradiction was painful. Food prices in U.S. grocery stores soared nearly 18% year over year, yet farmers saw their incomes collapse. Families paying more at checkout assumed farmers were getting rich. In reality, the profits were being swallowed by processors and distributors, while those who grew the food faced insolvency. And for the first time in decades, the anger turned political. Farmers who once backed Washington's hardline trade stance now felt betrayed. Bailouts weren't salvation, they were shackles, keeping them dependent while real solutions slipped further away. The Farm Belt didn't want charity. It wanted power back in its own hands, and that demand would lead to an unprecedented rebellion against Washington's authority. For decades, America's farm groups had been divided. The National Farmers Union leaned progressive, pushing for supply management and market protections. The American Farm Bureau Federation, by contrast, was a conservative anchor, often backing free market policies and presidential authority. These two groups almost never agreed. But 2025 changed everything. Faced with collapsing exports, vanishing buyers, and bailouts that felt more like bribes than solutions, the Farm Belt began to fight back. For the first time in modern history, organizations across the political spectrum united around one demand: strip the president of unchecked tariff power. The National Farmers Union and the American Soybean Association publicly supported legislation requiring Congress to approve sweeping trade actions. Even the Farm Bureau, the same group that once defended aggressive trade policies, broke ranks and joined the cause. Their message was clear. The White House could no longer be trusted with unilateral authority that left farmers as collateral damage. Industry voices echoed the urgency. Peter Friedman of the Agriculture Transportation Coalition didn't mince words when he told CNBC, "This is not approaching a crisis. This is a full-blown crisis." Coming from one of agriculture's most respected trade advocates, it was a warning shot aimed directly at Washington. What made this rebellion even more remarkable was its timing. Farmers weren't just pleading for change. They were organizing in the middle of their own collapse. With loans defaulting, shipments canceled, and equipment repossessed, they still found the strength to unite politically. Because they knew the stakes, if they didn't reclaim power now, they might not have a future left to fight for. But even with momentum building, the reality was grim. Ending tariffs wouldn't magically bring China back. The damage was systemic, and the farm economy was bleeding from within. By 2025, the contradiction at the heart of American agriculture could no longer be ignored. On one side, consumers were paying more than ever. Food prices had jumped 18% year over year. On the other, farm incomes were collapsing. Families at the grocery store believed rising costs meant farmers were cashing in. But in truth, the profits were being captured further up the chain by massive processors, distributors, and multinational corporations. Take Callan Foods, which posted over $1 billion in profits during the 2024 food shortage. While corporate giants thrived, small and mid-sized farms were gasping for air. Input costs surged, especially feed, which rose 20% thanks to tariffs on Canadian imports. Farmers couldn't raise their prices, couldn't compete with global suppliers, and couldn't find buyers. They were trapped. The deeper issue was structural. U.S. food production was no longer tethered to farmer profitability. It was tied to global trade flows and corporate logistics. Decades of policy, from NAFTA to modern farm bills, had encouraged overproduction while outsourcing price stability to foreign buyers. That system only worked if exports were reliable. Once China and other nations pulled away, the model collapsed. Bloomberg reported that more than 40% of soy, corn, and wheat growers said they could no longer break even without stable export contracts. Bankruptcies loomed. Rural banks reported loan defaults rising across agricultural counties. What was once America's greatest strength, its vast farm belt, was now its most fragile weakness. Instead of fostering independence, Washington's trade wars created dependency without resilience. Farmers weren't competitors anymore. They were hostages of policy swings and corporate monopolies. And unless something radically changed, the Farm Belt wasn't just facing a bad season, it was staring down a systemic collapse. But history showed there had been another way. A smarter way, one America had abandoned. Long before trade wars and bailouts, America had another system, one designed not just to protect farmers, but to stabilize the entire food supply. During the New Deal era of the 1930s, supply management created price floors, conservation incentives, and strategic reserves. Farmers weren't left to gamble everything on volatile markets. They had a safety net built into policy. For decades, it worked. Prices stayed stable, exports remained competitive, and rural America thrived. But over time, that system was dismantled in favor of globalized trade. Washington promised that free markets and international buyers would deliver prosperity. For a while, it seemed to work, until tariffs, retaliation, and collapsing contracts exposed just how fragile the model truly was. Research from the University of Missouri revealed a shocking truth. If supply management had been maintained through 2020, it would have cost 37% less than the bailouts farmers ended up receiving, while still preserving export competitiveness. In other words, America spent more to fail than it would have spent to succeed. Pairing such a system with modern strategies, like the CHIPS Act for industrial resilience or climate-smart subsidies for sustainable agriculture, could have turned tariffs into a tool, not a weapon of self-destruction. With the right policies, America could have built resilience instead of dependence, and strength instead of fragility. Instead, the U.S. entered the 2020s clinging to outdated tools, while rivals like Brazil, Argentina, and even Canada modernized their strategies. America fought a 21st-century trade war with 1930s tactics, and lost. Which leaves the Farm Belt with one haunting question. If the old safeguards are gone, the markets have moved on, and bailouts can't buy back trust, who will survive what comes next? The story of America's Farm Belt isn't about numbers on a spreadsheet, it's about survival. Families who spent generations feeding the world now face the grim reality of empty contracts, overflowing silos, and loans they can't repay. Farmers in Iowa, Kansas, and Kentucky are planting fields they know will lose money, not because they see profit ahead, but because not planting at all means bankruptcy will swallow them even faster. This is not ambition, this is triage. Tariffs were sold as leverage, a tool to protect American strength. But instead of shielding farmers, they shattered the foundation of rural life. Global buyers didn't wait for Washington's next move. They moved on, locking in deals with Brazil, Argentina, and Canada. What America lost wasn't just a market, it was trust. And once trust is broken in global trade, it rarely returns. Meanwhile, consumers pay more at the grocery store while farmers earn less in the fields. Corporate giants profit, rural communities vanish, and Washington responds with the same recycled answer: bailouts. But checks can't reopen ports, can't rewrite contracts, and can't rebuild the confidence of buyers who now see America as unstable and unreliable. The haunting question now isn't when the Farm Belt will collapse, it's who will still be standing when it does. Because this crisis isn't about a single season or even a single crop. It's about the survival of the people who put food on America's tables. And as the clock ticks, one truth becomes undeniable. If nothing changes, the richest farm economy on Earth could be reduced to a shadow of itself. The collapse isn't coming. It's already here. The only question left is whether anyone will fight to save it before it's too late.